The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Wilson Park as 12-year-old Andrew sat on his favorite bench, carefully adjusting the straps on his prosthetic leg. He had just finished an intense basketball practice with his friends, something he never let his disability stop him from enjoying. The sound of children playing and birds chirping filled the air, making it a perfect spring day in Atlanta. Andrew had gotten pretty good at making quick adjustments to his prosthetic leg over the years. It was just another part of his daily routine, like tying his shoes or fixing his basketball shorts. Some of the younger kids at the park would sometimes watch him with curiosity, and he'd always give them a friendly wave. He was proud of his prosthetic leg. It was a symbol of his resilience and determination. As he finished tightening the last strap, a police cruiser rolled up slowly to the park entrance. Andrew didn't think much of it at first. Police officers often patrolled the area, usually just making their regular rounds. But this time was different. Officer Wilson stepped out of his vehicle, his eyes fixed directly on Andrew and his prosthetic leg. The officer's boots crunched against the gravel path as he approached. Andrew noticed how the officer's hand rested near his radio, his pace deliberate and measured. Something about the way the officer walked made Andrew's stomach tighten with anxiety. He had never been in trouble before, and he couldn't imagine why a police officer would be interested in him. "Hey there, young man," Officer Wilson called out, his voice carrying across the park. A few nearby parents turned to watch. "What do you have there?" He gestured toward Andrew's prosthetic leg, his expression stern and questioning. Andrew's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady as he responded, "This is my prosthetic leg, sir. I was just adjusting it after basketball practice." He pointed to the court where some of his friends were still playing, hoping the officer would understand this was just a normal afternoon for him. But Officer Wilson's expression didn't soften. Instead, he pulled out his notepad and began writing. "We've had reports of stolen medical equipment in this area. That's a pretty expensive piece of equipment you've got there. Mind telling me how you got it?" The question hit Andrew like a punch to the gut. He felt his face grow hot as more people in the park began to stare. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, wanting to call his mom. "Sir, this is my leg. I've had it for 3 years. My mom has all the paperwork at home. I can call her right now." Officer Wilson's body camera blinked steadily, recording everything. The red light seemed to mock Andrew as the officer continued his questioning, each word making the boy feel smaller and more helpless. The same park where he had just been playing basketball with his friends now felt like a spotlight, with him center stage in a show he never wanted to be part of. Parents who knew Andrew from the neighborhood began to gather nearby, their faces showing a mix of concern and disbelief. Mrs. Johnson, who ran the local bakery and had known Andrew since he was little, stepped forward to speak up, but Officer Wilson held up his hand, stopping her before she could say a word. The sound of basketballs bouncing had stopped. Andrew's friends stood frozen on the court, watching the scene unfold. The only sounds now were the officer's radio crackling with static and the distant chirping of birds that seemed oblivious to the tension building in their park. What started as a perfect spring afternoon had suddenly turned into something else entirely. Andrew couldn't have known that this moment would not only change his life, but would also expose a surprising connection that would transform his community's understanding of prejudice, healing, and the unexpected ways that people's lives can intersect. The tension in the park grew thicker as Officer Wilson reached for his radio, his eyes never leaving the prosthetic leg. Andrew's phone buzzed in his hand, a text from his mom saying she was on her way. But before she could arrive, the situation took an unimaginable turn. "I'm going to have to take this in for verification," Officer Wilson announced, his voice carrying across the now silent park. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unreal. Andrew's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. This couldn't be happening, not here, not now, not to him. "But sir," Andrew's voice cracked slightly, "how am I supposed to get home?" He gestured to the basketball court, now seeming miles away. "I can't walk without it." The absurdity of the situation might have been funny if it wasn't so frightening. Here he was, having to explain to a grown man why he needed his own leg. Mrs. Johnson from the bakery couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Officer, this boy has been coming to this park for years. We all know him. This is his leg." Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Other parents nodded in agreement, but Officer Wilson remained unmoved. "Ma'am, I'm following protocol," the officer responded, his tone mechanical. "There have been 3 cases of stolen medical equipment in this district this month alone. We have to verify the ownership." He pulled out an evidence bag, and Andrew watched in stunned silence as the officer began to document his prosthetic leg like it was a piece of evidence in a crime. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Officer Wilson carefully placed the prosthetic leg into the evidence bag. Andrew sat there, trying to process what was happening. The same leg that had helped him score his first basketball point, the same leg he'd decorated with stickers from his favorite teams, was being treated like stolen property. Some of the younger kids who had been playing nearby started asking their parents questions in loud whispers. "Why is the police officer taking his leg? How will he walk?" The innocent questions made the situation feel even more surreal. Andrew could feel his cheeks burning with embarrassment, but he tried to keep his composure. A small crowd had gathered now, many filming with their phones. Andrew could hear the murmurs of disbelief and anger. His best friend's dad was already on the phone with the local news station. The community that had watched Andrew grow up, had cheered him on at basketball games, and had celebrated his achievements wasn't going to stay silent. Officer Wilson seemed oblivious to the community's reaction as he filled out his paperwork. "Your mother can claim this at the station with proper documentation," he stated, as if he was explaining a simple parking ticket. "We'll need the original prescription, proof of purchase, and medical records confirming the necessity of the prosthetic." Andrew's phone buzzed again. His mom was 5 minutes away. But those 5 minutes felt like an eternity as he sat there, watching Officer Wilson walk back to his cruiser with his leg in an evidence bag. The same leg that had given him his independence was now being taken away in front of everyone. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. But they weren't coming for Officer Wilson. It was the local news van, arriving just as Officer Wilson's cruiser pulled away from the curb. The story was about to become much bigger than a simple misunderstanding in a neighborhood park. As Andrew waited for his mom, surrounded by supportive neighbors and friends, he couldn't have known that this humiliating moment would soon uncover a surprising truth about Officer Wilson's own family, a truth that would change everything. But for now, all he could do was watch his leg disappear in the back of a police cruiser, wondering how a perfect spring afternoon had turned into this nightmare. By nightfall, the video of Andrew's prosthetic leg being confiscated had spread like wildfire across social media. The body camera footage, released by a concerned officer within the department, painted an even clearer picture of what had happened in the park. People couldn't believe their eyes. A disabled child being treated like a criminal over his own prosthetic leg. The local news station's evening broadcast led with the story. "Tonight, we bring you a disturbing incident from Wilson Park," the anchor began, her voice grave. The footage played on screens across the city, showing Andrew sitting helplessly on the bench as his leg was taken away. Each replay made the community's anger grow stronger. Andrew's mom stood before the cameras, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "My son has been using this prosthetic leg for 3 years. He's just a child who loves playing basketball. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that someone took his leg because they didn't believe it belonged to him?" The community's response was swift and powerful. By morning, a crowd had gathered outside the police station. They weren't just angry protesters. These were Andrew's teachers, his basketball coach, medical professionals from the hospital where he got his prosthetic, and dozens of families from the neighborhood. They carried signs reading, "Give him back his leg," and "Dignity is not optional." Mrs. Johnson had closed her bakery for the day to organize support. She set up a table with free coffee and pastries for the protesters and started collecting signatures for a petition demanding changes in police training. "I've watched that boy grow up," she told reporters, wiping tears from her eyes. "He comes to my bakery every Saturday morning. He's never been anything but polite and kind. This is just wrong." The local disability rights group joined the cause, bringing their own stories of discrimination and misunderstanding. A veteran in a wheelchair shared his experiences. "When people see medical equipment, they shouldn't automatically assume the worst. We're human beings, not suspects." Social media couldn't get enough of the story. The hashtag supporting Andrew trended nationwide, with celebrities and athletes sharing their outrage. a professional basketball player who used a prosthetic leg posted a video message. To the young man who had his leg taken, "Keep your head up. We're all behind you." Inside the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered among themselves, many uncomfortable with how the situation had been handled. The chief of police called an emergency meeting, knowing this incident would require more than just a simple apology. Local businesses started showing their support too. The sporting goods store where Andra bought his basketball gear put up a giant poster in their window, "Standing with our community." The owner announced they would donate sports equipment to programs supporting young athletes with disabilities. But the most surprising support came from within the police department itself. Several officers, including some who had worked with Officer Wilson, stepped forward to share their concerns about similar incidents they'd witnessed. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about a deeper problem that needed addressing. Andra spent that day at home, missing school and basketball practice. His friends came by with their parents, bringing cards and small gifts. His basketball team sent a video of them all wearing tags on their shoes with his jersey number. The love and support were overwhelming, but he still felt the sting of humiliation from the previous day. What nobody knew yet was that this incident was about to uncover something much bigger than a single mistake by one officer. As investigators began looking into Officer Wilson's background, they discovered a connection that would change the entire narrative, a personal story that would help everyone understand why this incident hit so close to home for more people than anyone could have imagined. As Internal Affairs dug deeper into the incident, they discovered something that nobody saw coming. In Officer Wilson's desk drawer, they found an old photograph, a picture of a police officer in a wheelchair, proudly wearing his uniform while displaying a prosthetic leg. The man in the photo was Officer Wilson's father, a retired police sergeant. The investigation took an unexpected turn. Officer Wilson was called in for questioning, but this time it wasn't just about his actions in the park. The interviewer, a veteran internal affairs detective, noticed how Officer Wilson's hands trembled when he looked at his father's photo. "Tell me about your father," the detective said softly, pushing a cup of coffee across the table. The question seemed to break something open in Officer Wilson. His stern facade crumbled as he began to speak about his dad, who had lost his leg 20 years ago in the line of duty. "He was chasing a suspect," Officer Wilson explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The guy pushed him off a bridge. Dad survived, but he lost his leg." He paused, struggling with his words. "He never let it stop him, though. He came back to work, finished his career, and then—" Officer Wilson's voice trailed off. The detective leaned forward. "And then what?" "He started a foundation," Officer Wilson continued. "He helps kids get prosthetic limbs when their families can't afford them. He's helped dozens of children over the years." The irony of the situation began to dawn on Officer Wilson's face as he spoke. Meanwhile, across town, Andra and his mom were meeting with their lawyer when they received some surprising news. The lawyer had been doing his own research into Andra's prosthetic leg and discovered something remarkable. The foundation that had helped fund Andra's prosthetic 3 years ago was run by none other than retired Sergeant Wilson. The lawyer spread the documents across his desk. "Your prosthetic leg," he said to Andra, "was partially funded by the same foundation that Officer Wilson's father runs." The room fell silent as everyone processed this incredible coincidence. Back at the police station, Officer Wilson was looking through his father's foundation records when he saw it, Andra's name, right there in the files from 3 years ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had confiscated a leg from a child his own father had helped. The weight of his actions crashed down on him. All those years watching his father help children get prosthetic limbs, all those foundation fundraisers he'd attended, all those stories of hope and transformation he'd heard. And still, he had let his prejudices cloud his judgment in that park. Officer Wilson's father, now retired and running the foundation full-time, was in Florida at a medical conference when the news reached him. He watched the viral video of his son confiscating Andra's leg, and his heart broke twice, once for Andra and once for his son, who had somehow lost sight of the values he tried so hard to instill. The retired sergeant immediately booked a flight home. He knew better than anyone what it meant to have your mobility, your independence, your dignity taken away. He had lived it, fought through it, and dedicated his life to making sure others wouldn't have to struggle as he did. As the sun set on another day of protests outside the police station, nobody yet knew how this personal connection would change everything. The story that had sparked outrage across the nation was about to take another turn, one that would challenge everyone's assumptions about hatred, healing, and the unexpected ways that life connects us all. The retired surgeon's arrival at the airport drew little attention. Nobody recognized the older man in the wheelchair as he made his way through the terminal, his own prosthetic leg hidden beneath his pants. But this man, who had spent the last decade changing lives through his foundation, was about to change one more, his own son's. He went straight to the police station, rolling past the protesters who were still gathered outside. Some held signs featuring his son's face now, demanding his resignation. The irony wasn't lost on him. His life's work had been about giving people mobility and dignity, while his son had taken both from a child. Inside the station, Officer Wilson was at his desk, head in his hands, surrounded by Foundation documents. He looked up when he heard the familiar sound of his father's wheelchair. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. The last time they had seen each other was at a Foundation fundraiser where they had celebrated helping their 100th child get a prosthetic leg. "I saw the video," the retired surgeon said quietly. "No hello, no warm greeting, just the weight of those 4 words hanging in the air. That boy, Andre. I remember when he came to the Foundation. His mom had been saving for years but still couldn't afford the full cost. He told me he wanted to play basketball." Officer Wilson's face crumpled. "Dad, I didn't know. I was just following up on those medical equipment theft reports and..." His father held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You saw a black kid with an expensive prosthetic leg and made assumptions," his father said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The same kind of assumptions people made about me when I first came back to work after my accident. Remember how angry you were when that suspect called me a broken cop?" The memory hit Officer Wilson hard. He had been just a teenager then, watching his father struggle to prove he could still be an effective police officer despite his prosthetic leg. He remembered the whispers, the doubts, the sideways glances his father endured. "I started this foundation because I knew what it felt like to have people question your right to exist in certain spaces," the retired surgeon continued. "To have them look at your disability as something suspicious rather than something you've overcome. You used to understand that." Across town, Andrew was back at the park, sitting on the same bench where everything had happened. His prosthetic leg had been returned with an official apology from the department, but the memory of that day still stung. He was surprised to see a familiar van pull into the parking lot, the same van that had delivered his prosthetic leg 3 years ago. The retired surgeon wheeled himself toward Andra, with Officer Wilson walking slowly behind him. The boy's mom stood protectively nearby, watching carefully. The old surgeon reached out his hand to Andra, and in that moment, something remarkable happened. Andrew noticed the surgeon's pants leg had risen slightly, revealing his own prosthetic. His eyes widened with recognition. He remembered this man, the one who had helped him get his leg, who had told him stories about playing basketball with his own prosthetic to encourage him. "I believe," the retired surgeon said, looking between his son and Andra, "that we all have something to learn from each other." He pulled out an old photo album from his bag, filled with pictures of children his foundation had helped. Children of all backgrounds, all united by their determination to live life fully despite their disabilities. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. There were tears, uncomfortable truths, and painful admissions. But as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, something began to heal. Not just between Andrew and Officer Wilson, but within Officer Wilson himself, who finally began to understand the true meaning of his father's life's work. What nobody realized yet was that this moment in the park would spark a change much bigger than any of them. The story of a father's dedication to helping others, a son's journey to overcome his prejudices, and a boy's courage in the face of injustice was about to transform their entire community's understanding of disability rights and human dignity. The police station's community room had never been so full. People squeezed into every available space, some standing against the walls, others sitting cross-legged on the floor. Officer Wilson stood at the podium, his father's wheelchair positioned beside him, facing Andra and his family in the front row. "I came here today," Officer Wilson began, his voice shaking slightly, not just to apologize, but to share what I've learned. He glanced at his father, drawing strength from the older man's presence. My own father lost his life protecting this community, and he turned that loss into a mission to help others. Yet somehow, I forgot those lessons when I saw Ander in the park. The room was silent, every person hanging on his words. Even the usual shuffle of feet and whispered conversations had stopped. Officer Wilson continued, pulling out his badge. This badge means I'm supposed to protect and serve everyone in our community. But that day in the park, I failed. I let assumptions and prejudice guide my actions instead of compassion and understanding. Andrew's mom was holding her son's hand tightly as Officer Wilson spoke. Her face showed a mix of emotions, pain from the memory of that day, but also a glimmer of hope for what this moment might mean for other families like hers. The retired sergeant wheeled himself forward, taking the microphone. 20 years ago, when I lost my leg, many people thought my police career was over. But this community stood by me. They believed in me. That's why I started the foundation, to pass that support on to others. He turned to look at Andra. And now we have a chance to turn this painful incident into something positive. Together, they unveiled their plan. The police department would partner with the foundation to create a new training program. Officers would learn directly from people with disabilities, understanding their experiences, challenges, and rights. But more than that, they would learn to see the person first, not the disability. Andrew was invited to speak next. Standing tall at the podium, his prosthetic leg now a symbol of strength rather than shame, he shared his story. He talked about his love for basketball, his dreams for the future, and how it felt to have his dignity stripped away that day in the park. His words weren't angry or bitter, they were honest and hopeful. I don't want any other kid to go through what I did, he said, looking directly at Officer Wilson. But I also believe people can learn and change. That's why I'm going to help with the training program. Maybe my story can help other officers understand. The community room erupted in applause. Mrs. Johnson from the bakery was openly crying. Andrew's basketball coach stood up, offering to involve the whole team in disability awareness events. One by one, people came forward with ideas and offers to help. Officer Wilson's father watched it all with quiet pride. His foundation had always been about more than just providing prosthetic limbs. It was about building understanding and breaking down barriers. Now, his son's mistake was becoming a catalyst for exactly that kind of change. As the meeting ended, something remarkable happened. People didn't rush to leave. Instead, they stayed, talking in small groups, sharing stories, and making plans. The retired sergeant found himself surrounded by parents of children with disabilities, all eager to get involved with the Foundation's new initiatives. Outside the station, a news crew was waiting. But this time, they weren't there to cover a scandal. They were there to document a community coming together, turning a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for education and growth. The reporter watched as Officer Wilson, his father Andra, and his family walked out together, no longer divided by that day in the park, but united in their mission to create change. What had started as a tragic misunderstanding was transforming into something powerful, a movement that would ripple far beyond their city, touching lives that they hadn't even imagined yet. And it all began because one boy had the courage to share his story, one officer had the humility to acknowledge his mistakes, and one father had never given up on his mission to make the world a little better for everyone. 1 year later, the same park where everything had started looked different. Not because anything had physically changed, but because of what was happening there. On this sunny afternoon, police officers sat in a circle with kids and teenagers, some with prosthetic limbs, others in wheelchairs, all sharing stories and experiences. Officer Wilson stood to the side, watching the scene with his father. The retired surgeon's foundation had grown exponentially over the past year, now partnering with police departments across the country. What had happened in their city had sparked a national conversation about police interactions with people with disabilities. Remember that day? Officer Wilson asked his father softly, looking at the bench where he had confronted Andra. His father nodded but smiled. They both knew that dark day had led to something extraordinary. The police department had completely transformed its training program. Every new officer now spent time at the foundation, meeting families and learning about different disabilities. But more importantly, they learned to see beyond their initial assumptions and recognized the humanity in every person they served. Andrew had become a regular speaker at police academies. His story, told with honesty and hope, helped future officers understand the impact their actions could have on someone's life. He was no longer just the boy who had his leg taken away. He was a voice for change. "Hey, everyone," Andrew called out, dribbling a basketball toward the group. "Who's ready for the game?" It was time for the monthly basketball match between officers and kids from the community. These games had become a favorite tradition, breaking down barriers and building relationships in ways that formal training never could. Officer Wilson joined the game, playing alongside kids he once might have viewed with suspicion. The sound of laughter and friendly trash talk filled the air. Parents watched from the sidelines, many of them remembering how different things had been just a year ago. Mrs. Johnson's bakery had become the unofficial headquarters for their monthly meetings. Her display window now featured photos of community events and newspaper clippings about the foundation's work. She loved telling customers how a terrible incident had turned into something beautiful. The local news crew arrived to cover the anniversary of the incident, but they found a very different story than they expected. Instead of anger and division, they saw healing and unity. The reporter watched as Officer Wilson helped a young girl adjust her prosthetic leg before joining the basketball game. "It's not just about better police training," the retired sergeant explained to the camera. "It's about creating a community where everyone feels seen, respected, and valued." He gestured to the game, where officers and kids played together, their differences forgotten in the joy of the moment. Andrew's mom stood nearby, watching her son teach a young officer how to dribble while wearing a prosthetic leg. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of pain anymore. They were tears of pride and hope. The foundation had helped 30 more kids get prosthetic limbs in the past year, more than any year before. Each success story was celebrated by the entire community. Officer Wilson attended every fitting, remembering how close he had come to destroying a child's dignity instead of protecting it. As the sun began to set, the game wound down. Officer Wilson gathered everyone for a group photo. In the front row, Andrew stood tall between Officer Wilson and his father, all three of them smiling. Behind them, officers and kids, parents and community members all squeezed together, their faces glowing with genuine joy. The photo would soon hang in the police station's lobby, reminding every officer who walked through those doors that their job wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about protecting human dignity and building bridges of understanding. The story of the officer who took a boy's prosthetic leg hadn't been forgotten. Instead, it had been transformed into a powerful lesson about prejudice, redemption, and the strength of a community that refuses to let fear and misunderstanding divide them. And in that transformation, they had all found something precious: the understanding that our differences don't have to divide us, they can bring us closer together.